I thought if I could understand these works in a real way, then I can understand painting in a deeper way. And it took me a long time to understand it, really in an honest way. My name's Alvaro Barrington. I was born in 1983 in Caracas. My dad always tells the story how at the time men weren't allowed in the hospital while the women were giving birth, so he had to bribe the nurse to allow him to see me. I moved shortly afterwards to Grenada to live with my grandma. My mom thought it was best for me, and I think ultimately she was right. I had a really great childhood in the Caribbean. I really got a chance to be a kid, even though I was a very bad kid. And took full liberties. And my mom had been living in New York, and then ultimately I moved to New York. So, I started going back and forth, and then eventually I just stayed. And then I was there for quite some time. You know, I have very specific memories. So I have memories of picking the gray hair of my grandma's hair in Grenada, or almost drowning in the ocean, or smoking weed, or all these little stuff, you know. And then in New York, I have, of course, I was a little bit older, so I have much stronger memories. You know, most of my memories before I was 7 are stories people told me. So there's much of my memories is more of people being like, do you remember when you did this? Or do you remember when you did that? Or do you remember when we did this together? And those become like how I understand it. I was always a maker. I mean, I find myself constantly in situations. If there's a tablecloth in front of me and a marker, I'm going to draw on it. And so I always, there's something about my mind that needs to do certain things in moments, because that's the only way the moment becomes very real for me somehow. It's like a linkage somehow, you know, it's like my memory gets linked with, I'm doing this thing physically, and therefore I'm understanding this moment. This moment stays in my memory longer. So I was always a maker. And then I was doing a lot of shitty jobs. Not shitty, but like jobs to pay the bills. You know, I was working retail or coffee shops or whatever, delivery jobs. And I was turning 25. I thought, okay, let me leave New York, let me go somewhere. So I got a ticket, I went back to Caracas, and got on a trip to the Orinoco River, and was reflecting on the energy that I was in these people with who I met, who I hung out with. I was hanging out with all these artists in Caracas, and I just thought, these young artists, and I thought there was something about this energy. It was like, what is it that these are the people I'm meeting. You know, I always have a phrase that if you are an asshole, no matter where you go, you'll only meet assholes. You know, if you're XYZ, you generally tend to attract, over time, you will generally attract that energy. So whenever I'm in a fucked up situation, I always go, what is my energy that's putting me in this situation? So I always find that it's a choice that I've made. I've chosen to exercise something, a hurt, an anger, whatever, and now it's led me to be in a position that I don't want to be in. And so I thought there was something about being in Venezuela that I was like, oh, I'm meeting artists. I've went to art school my entire life. There's something in the language of who I am that is just attracting different people to me, this type of people to me. So that's when I knew I had to go down that path somehow, because I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the people I met, and I enjoyed the conversations. I enjoyed the way they saw the world, and I thought I needed to go down this road. And so I didn't know where to start, so I went back to New York. I transferred to Hunter College. I stayed there for quite some time, because I went there and then it was very different. People would talk about like Foucault or whatever, so I would go, I don't know what Foucault's talking about. Maybe I don't get this art. I just know how to make. So then I became a philosophy major, because I was like, I don't get what people are talking about. They're referencing all these different philosophers and ways of thinking. Maybe I need to understand that somehow. So then I became a philosophy major. And then I went back and I would hear people talk about Foucault and all this stuff, and I realized they didn't know shit that they were talking about, that the art wasn't really art. It was just them, they took a philosophy class at 10 o'clock, and then at 1 o'clock they had an art crit, and so they needed to justify it somehow. So I did that back and forth. Or people would talk about politics at the time, so I said, I don't really get politics, I don't understand politics. Let me go and take political science. So I did that for several years, and then people would talk about global history, because it was a pretty global university, and so I said, okay, let me go take global history. So every time I found myself lost in what somebody told me they were doing in their work, in their paintings, and I knew I didn't have an entry point, I would go back and I would take classes, because it was reasonably affordable at the time. And that was a way for me to understand what they were doing. Most of the time I realized they don't know what the fuck they're talking about. They're literally just bullshitting. But I found it also helped me understand what I wanted to make better. There's all these ways you could define art. There's the academic tradition of art, which is what we see in museums or galleries, etc. And that comes from like a kind of lineage that we have. And as a kid, I would have to go to museums because I was doing drawings and stuff like that. And I vividly remember seeing Les Demoiselles d'Avignon in high school, and many subsequent years after at MoMA. And I knew it was an important painting. Whenever I went there, I would look at it. I would look at Matisse the Moroccan. And it became a touch point, because I thought if I could understand these works in a real way, then I can understand painting in a deeper way. And it took me a long time to understand it, really in an honest way. And part of it was understanding that it was, for Western culture, the most severe acknowledgement of other cultures' geniuses. Now, one can also say it was the moment where colonialism and imperialism was at its highest. These African mask wasn't just here out of nowhere. Picasso was essentially a foreigner. He wasn't Parisian. I think now the EU is such an ingrained idea within Europeans that one very rarely think about how contentious that moment was for even a Spanish person to be here. It was an era that you saw so many wars. And so what you really had was a real dealing with a kind of, Matisse in Morocco, Picasso himself, a foreigner in Spain, looking at, And that became much more of an interesting story for me, myself, someone who had been in so many different places, who grew up in a city where all of these things, where everybody's from there, but nobody's from there, but everybody's from there. It's a country everybody's from, but nobody's from, unless you're Native American. So it was really, it gave me an entry point to understand these paintings. And so it wasn't the first art. I'm sure, the first art I saw was probably my mother. My dad, who bribed the hospitals so that he could see his son, his first son. That's art. Wow, I'm becoming a dad. I don't remember it, but I'm sure the joy in my dad's eyes that I still see actually when I see him. Yeah, that's art.